Hello, welcome to NieuwRechts, or for the English listeners, NieuwRight. My name is Daniël de Liever, and I'm happy to have this conversation with Frank Furedi, the director of MCC. Thank you for your time to be here.
Nice to talk to you. Hi.
It's for people that don't know you, you're like a renowned sociologist, emeritus professor of sociology at the University of Kent, author of many books, and media commentator. The first question I would have is, what kind of gave you the motivation to strive for all these academic things in your life for this kind of career?
Well, I've always been interested in academia, and I've always been interested in history, philosophy, sociology. So when I was young, I decided to become an academic, and in the course of becoming an academic, I felt it was very important to use my training to write books about the problems facing society, and in particular, to kind of write stuff that engages with the cultural wars that are being fought now. Because I felt there were very few people in universities who were prepared to challenge the kind of very kind of negative cultural ideals that are being promoted in higher education.
You are known for speaking out against the culture war. Maybe before we dive into it, maybe you could explain what is the culture war?
I think the culture war is really an attempt to call into question all the fundamental ideals and values of Western civilization, to kind of render them negative, to almost demonize them. And at the same time, it's really about displacing the way we looked at the world in the past, the kind of national identities that we had, displacing that with what today we call identity politics. So basically, at the moment, for example, here in Brussels, every identity is okay. Gay identity, lesbian identity, black identity, disabled identity. The one identity that isn't okay is national identity. And that's the one thing that's seen as being very negative. And you have this continuous attempt to undermine many of the ways of being, the values, the beliefs that were integral to European civilization.
Vergeet de NOS en de NPO. Het is tijd voor NieuwRechts, de nieuwswebsite voor rechtsdenken Nederland.
And a lot of people like that, I guess, like the European culture, they feel kind of demoralized. A lot of common people as well. What would you tell people who feel demoralized? What can they do about moving the future of Europe in a more positive direction?
I think the first thing I would tell them is not to feel sorry for themselves, because that leads to paralysis, and it basically means that things will only get worse. I think the important thing is to do what the little boy did when he saw the emperor and said the emperor had no clothes. We got to open our mouth, not censor ourselves. We got to indicate what we believe in. And sometimes we have to make a bit of noise. Other times we need to organize together and particularly find issues on which we can mobilize and raise an alternative political view. So, for example, I think it's quite important that some of the ideals such as patriotism, which are often seen as negative, are things that we celebrate. It's quite important that we argue that we want to live in a society where the connection between the present and the past is celebrated and is seen as being really important. We want to live in a society where we think that the family is not something that we just want to reject or not take seriously, but is central to the bringing up of children and for generations to interact with each other. So basically, I think that it's voicing things that people already know to be true, but making sure that we're voicing it loud and clear.
So if I get it right, what you're saying, people should not be ashamed of their heritage, of also the fundamental foundation that gave rise to a great European culture. And I think a lot of people, they feel this, but it's hard for them to make it concrete. Yes, they can see their family, but when they are attacked from the outside in this culture war, they don't always have the tools to articulate what they are feeling. And what can people do around that, you think?
Well, I think there's two things. One is that we need to write and explain to people what's going on and use online, offline medium to express that, to communicate that. And then secondly, we need to mobilize. So for example, I think it's important that in the Netherlands, parents are very clear about what their kids are learning in school. And they should make very, very clear that they want their children to learn about what is important about being Dutch, rather than learn about why being Dutch is a problem. I think they need to look into the school curriculum and make sure that the teachers and the school system know that they expect an education that instills a degree of pride in their national heritage. There's always very specific things you can do. And it's just a question of having the confidence to, first of all, voice it, and then secondly, to mobilize around it.
I think that's a great point. And when we talk about mobilizing, of course, your latest book, I guess, talks about this, like the war against the past. We've talked about the culture war, but the war against the past, maybe to some people might sound not fatalistic, but extreme in a way. Can we really talk that there's a war against the past, and why would you think so?
Well, I think we can talk about it because, when you listen to the cultural institutions in Europe, the people that run these institutions, whether it's universities, schools, or museum and art, they always provide a picture of the past that is very negative, where it's almost like they're encouraging people to be ashamed of being Belgian, ashamed of being Dutch, or ashamed of being English. And in that extent, what they're doing is they're basically saying they're disconnecting us from who we are, where we kind of come from. And that's particularly damaging to young people, because if young people have no idea what their link is with their ancestors, and if they're completely disconnected, dispossessed of their heritage, they will have no idea of their identity, who they are, what they're about. And that will make it very difficult for them to gain the strength and the kind of clarity they will need to grow up and be strong adults. So this is an important struggle because we need to have a strong sense of connection with where we come from if we're going to be able to confidently go forward into the future.
Well, what would you say to people? There are a lot of progressives in the Netherlands. It's like predominantly nowadays a progressive country. They would say, maybe there were some good things in the past, but things are definitely better now. We're morally in a better place. An example that's always given, for example, is that we don't have slavery now. We used to have slavery, so our ancestors were morally worse than we are now. So it's not that important to look at the past. We already have everything figured out.
Well, the point is, the reason why we don't have slavery now is because people in the past have decided that it's wrong to have slaves. They kind of developed a critique of slavery. The point is that people, when they were confronted with the problem, decided that by and large, in a civilized democratic society, slavery had no place. So it wasn't us, it wasn't you, it wasn't me, or anybody living now who basically got rid of slavery, but it was people living beforehand. And the point is that in the past, people learn from their experiences. They make mistakes, but they also learn to correct them. That's a wonderful thing about the legacy of our civilization, that it's self-correcting all the time. We're able to solve problems and we're able to deal with our mistakes. So I would say that the people in the past probably knew less than you and I do, but they weren't morally better than we were. They were just as moral as everybody, as people are today. It's just that they were making their way in a very different kind of situation.
And this message, I guess, gets criticized a lot. That you speak out. You said you're willing to speak out. And one of the things that happened, of course, was that your book was cancelled by a bookshop when they tried to when you tried to put it there. Why do you think that it was cancelled?
I think they're a little bit silly. There's a section of the cultural intelligentsia, the cultural institutions, that is really hostile to allowing people with alternative views to be heard. They have a very censorious attitude towards public debate. They like to hear people like themselves, but when people have a different opinion, they try to kind of put a quarantine on them and prevent those views from being held. And I think that's very, very sad. It's very intolerant, because in a civilized society, you actually think that a clash of views, a debate about different sentiments, is good for everybody, because the whole society learns from that experience. But I think that's the interesting thing, is that the people that dominate our culture are also very unconfident about what they're doing. They don't have that kind of strong sense of conviction. Instead, so that's why they often resort to canceling people, to censoring books or censoring newspaper articles.
And does it ever personally affect you that they misportray your views or try to cancel you and silence you?
Well, we all like to be popular, but I've learned to live with the fact that I'm not loved by a section of society, and it doesn't actually bother me. I think what does bother me is not its impact on me. What bothers me is that a lot of people in our society don't get a chance to express themselves, to find their voice, because the minute they open their mouth, the same people that cancel me will try to cancel them as well, sit on them, and not allow them to make their voices heard. That is what really bothers me. A lot of people in Holland, in Netherlands, or in Belgium, don't really like, for example, mass migration. They don't really like multicultural societies, but they're too scared to open their mouth and say it, because they're worried about being called racist or xenophobic or homophobic or all these different words they use to silence dissent.
Yes, we hear it a lot also from people that we talk to, that they're happy that we speak out, and that you're also speaking out for them in a sense. That's also, maybe we can talk about like MCC Brussels. Of course, you're the executive director there. You're also at the forefront of this culture war. But let's start. What does MCC Brussels actually do, so people understand a little bit better?
Well, we do a few things. We do a lot of research, and we publish reports and articles on the big political issues of our time, which is very important to have material that we can use in this kind of culture war that we are fighting. We organize events, meetings, conferences, which is quite important, so that people can come together and learn from each other, gain confidence that there are other people with similar views. And sometimes we get involved and help people who are involved in important struggles. So, for example, during the farmers' protest in Europe, we're trying to create a network of different European farming communities to kind of come together from Spain and Belgium, and France and Germany, come together to support each other in this fight against people who are trying to destroy their way of life. So we do that as well, but mainly what we do is provide what I think are the important intellectual arguments and resources, ideas for other people to run with.
That's interesting. And why do you think, in the landscape that we have, what makes MCC Brussels necessary to you? What does it provide that other maybe conservative outlets do not provide in this sense?
Well, I think, unfortunately, a lot of conservative parties, you don't have very strong sort of backing from people who have got research experience, who have written books, who are able to communicate effectively. They haven't got think tanks like the left does or the other parties do. And when I came to Brussels, I realized that even the think tanks that were here, who you could say were conservative or right-wing, tended to be far too quiet, tended to be a little bit defensive, because they were worried about being picked off. Whereas, as long as I'm here, we're not going to be quiet. We're not going to be worried. We're going to be as loud as possible, and we're going to create as much noise as possible, because it's very, very important that we shake things up a little bit. And I'm convinced that given the quality of our ideas, we can shake things up a little bit so that it will be impossible for our opponents to ignore our arguments altogether.
And how have people in Brussels, let's say you're an opposing side, how have they reacted to the noise that you make?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, some people obviously don't like it. We're now getting more and more people around us who do like it. And there are a lot of people who are basically saying that I don't agree with you, but at least what you're saying is interesting, and we'll go away and think about it. So I do think that we're creating a bit of a stir, having a bit of an impact. But it's a long way to go. I think that hopefully in the next year, we can gain a greater momentum and get a greater audience for what we're saying, so that other people also will be raising these kinds of questions. I'm always looking for people from different countries to do something similar to what we're doing, so that together we can create a network of patriotic thinkers who can shake things up in Europe.
Let's say there are people watching that say, okay, I want to contribute to MCC Brussels. How can they learn more about you? How can they get in touch?
We got a website, MCC Brussels, and on the website we have a list of our meetings, both online and offline. We have publications that we publish. If you do want to get involved and participate and do something similar to what we're doing, it doesn't matter what country you're in, get in touch with us and we'll do whatever we can to provide you with some kind of assistance so that you too can give a lead in this very, very important culture war that we're conducting.
That's great. I'm also curious, like as the director of MCC, what have been like kind of the surprises and challenges for you in this role and for MCC Brussels?
I think my biggest surprise and my biggest challenge is the fact that there is a complete reluctance to engage in arguments, so that I'm not used to what's happening in Brussels, where literally nobody on the other side will want to talk to you. That literally nobody on the other side thinks that debating is important. I spent a lot of time in England, where at least I'm always arguing. For example, like on Sunday, yesterday, I was involved in on a panel with a Labour member of Parliament, and we had a very good discussion. You've got very different views than I do, but it's more normal for people to have a clash of views. Whereas in Brussels, it's totally polarized, and there's a kind of real defensive fear of open discussion, and that's one thing that's really shaken me up a little bit.
I can imagine. I think the moment that you stop talking with each other, also you cannot move forward in any way. I guess one of the, let's say, countries that this happens to a lot, of course, is Hungary itself. I guess especially if you look, for example, in the Netherlands and other Western countries, there's in the, let's say, mainstream media and politicians, there's a lot of criticism of Hungary. It's seen as like this corrupt, ultra-conservative country, and that only likes Russia and China. And why do you think that the left singles out, but also, of course, the European Commission, why they single out Hungary so much?
Well, I think the Hungarian government is very different than other governments in that they don't just simply react to the latest issue or to the next election. They have a long-term vision of building a very different society, one that is what values that is very different to that of the European Commission. And they see Hungary as a challenge, as a threat, because if Hungary gets away with being a patriotic country that has got and who's very proud of its national heritage, it's very proud of its conservative values, then that will be seen as an alternative model to what exists within Commission. And you can see this on many issues. So Hungary does not allow mass migration. It just closed the border because Hungary doesn't want a society that's got such a large number of migrants within its borders. That's the very opposite to what the Germans or the French or the Commission have been arguing for a very, very long time. So you've got two very different models of what a society should look like. And from their point of view, rather than saying, okay, the Hungarians do it differently than we do, they say what Hungary is doing is fascistic, it's authoritarian, it's horrible. So they make up these little fantasy stories that Hungary is somehow this horrible authoritarian society. And of course, anybody that goes to Hungary, all you got to do is just walk around and you will see that the real Hungary is nothing like the fantasy Hungary that the Brussels bureaucracy projects.
I think luckily there also are some people that have maybe a more realistic view of Hungary, but I see from my personal experience when people go to Hungary and they go back to their own country and then they feel like, why can we not have something similar in our own way, in our own country? So what could maybe right-wing people or conservatives learn from Hungary so they can also realize a little bit of what Hungary has been able to do?
I think it's difficult to say because every nation has got a different path. So what will work in the Netherlands might be very different than what works in Hungary or in Poland. I just think it's important for conservatives or for patriots in Netherlands to find ways and means of making sure that people hear their voice rather than people hear what the media says about them. Because that's the problem at the moment, that most people, when they see somebody that has right-wing views, they got a caricature that they develop through the media. But if they hear from you and they hear you use, they begin to realize that many of the things that you stand for is more or less the same as what they think. And I think somehow we got to make that kind of connection with our people, so that there's a kind of greater coming together of political activists and people in everyday society.
I think that's great. As someone who, I've been to several MCC events, I always like that there is this aspiration to make the best of our situation. I guess something that I'm curious how you think about this. I think that when we look at the past and the heritage that we have, I often feel that conservatives for a long period of time have kind of been complacent and they have let, let's say, the radical left take over. And I don't very often see accountability from conservatives on their part in what we're seeing now. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I think there's been a tremendous complacency of avoiding some of these issues and imagining that somehow it doesn't really matter very much what happens in terms of the way that the past is discussed, represented. All these things are not seen as being particularly important. And I think that one of the things that's really quite important is that people who see themselves as patriots or as conservative, that they begin to wake up a little bit and realize that the reason why they're being isolated isn't just because the other side is so clever, but because their own side has really been extremely lazy in developing a convincing alternative narrative to what has occurred. And I think it's really important to shake ourselves up, because it's our responsibility. No point blaming the other side. It's our responsibility to get our act together.
Thank you. I have one last question. Is you've done so many different things, and what would you actually want people to remember you for?
It's a very interesting question. I think I want people to basically remember me for my books that I've written, and hopefully they will find that if you look at the last 5 years of what I've written, I hope that maybe they get some inspiration from it. Maybe they will find there are some interesting ideas that they can take up and run with.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time. Also, thanks to our listeners and viewers. If you want to hear more from NieuwRechts, of course, you can check us out at our social media or at our website. And see you in the next time.
Thank you very much for talking to me.